So in this short presentation, I'll be looking at how it's possible that the world could both know about something as devastating as the Holodomor and not know about it. And I thought we might think about the applications for today with disinformation and whether or not some of the issues around the Holodomor apply to the other famines that we discuss in this consortium. The word Holodomor comes from two Ukrainian words, holod, which means starvation or hunger, and morete, to exterminate. So it's death or extermination by hunger. Oops, it's not advancing. It's kind of interesting. I'm sorry. There we go. In 1917, at the time of the Russian Revolution, most of the territory of Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. Then with the fall of the empire, there were competing forces fighting for the territory. There were Ukrainian forces, Bolsheviks, the White Army, Poles, Germans, Romanians, anarchists, and Ukrainian independence was declared in this period. But by 1922, the Bolsheviks had consolidated power. We can fast forward now to 1928 and Stalin's first 5-year plan. It was a wildly ambitious plan to turn the basically agricultural USSR into an industrial powerhouse. And part of the plan was the collectivization of agriculture, which meant that peasant farmers were to become laborers on vast state collective farms. Some of these peasant farmers called it a second serfdom. And those who resisted were branded kulaks. A kulak was supposedly a wealthier peasant and an exploiter, but the term in the end could have been used against anyone suspected of anti-Soviet beliefs. Collectivization met with bitter resistance, particularly in Ukraine, and those branded kulaks were thrown out of their homes and sometimes imprisoned, sent to Siberia, or even executed. More than 500,000 peasant farmers and their families met this fate. By the early 1930s, there were dangerous food shortages caused by excessive grain requisitioning and the chaos of collectivization. But when we speak of the Holodomor, we mean what happened next. And so it's something that the scholar Andrea Graziosi has called a famine within a famine. In 1932, local Ukrainian authorities were warning Moscow of the dire situation. And they were telling Moscow that the grain quotas that were assigned to Ukraine, this is the grain that Ukraine had to deliver to the state, that these quotas were completely impossible to meet. But the authorities did not only, they didn't decrease the quotas, they actually in some cases increased them. And villages that couldn't deliver the assigned amounts were fined. They had to pay in meat and potatoes and other foodstuffs. And they were further punished by being cut off from deliveries of basic goods like soap and kerosene. It became a crime that was punishable by death to take as much as a handful of wheat from a field. And you can see in this poster that the person on his knees collecting grain is depicted as a rat, called a freeloader, a thief, and a class enemy. The borders of the Ukrainian Republic were closed. An internal passport system was introduced and peasants were not entitled to passports. Teams of activists went house to house searching for hidden grain and often took whatever food they found, be it apples, squash, beans, even cooking utensils. In the territories you see marked in red, that would be Kiev and Kharkiv oblasts or provinces, 1 in 4 people in the countryside would die. There were journalists who reported on the famine. One was the young Welsh journalist Gareth Jones. You might know that there is a feature film about him directed by Agnieszka Holland. He was on a train to the city of Kharkiv. When he got off, he made an unauthorized stop and he walked through the Ukrainian countryside to see conditions for himself. In his journal, he describes walking along the train tracks, meeting a peasant farmer, being invited to his home. He writes, "He took me to his cottage, his daughter, his 3 little children. 2 of the smaller children were swollen." And Jones recounts what this man said. "If you had come before, we would have given you chicken and eggs and milk and fine bread. Now we have no bread in the house. They are killing us. People are dying of hunger." I don't have time to talk about the other journalists who did report on the famine. I'll mention their names: Malcolm Muggeridge of the Manchester Guardian and Rhea Kleiman. I will say about Kleiman, it's fascinating that if you had Googled her 10 years ago, you probably would have come up with little to nothing, because it's taken the work of scholars working in with microfiche and in libraries to look at publications that no longer exist and have yet to be digitized, so they're not online. Why is it that these journalists were not listened to? Walter Durrani was a correspondent in the New York Times. He was the most influential journalist based in Moscow. After Gareth Jones returned home and had a press conference to talk about what he'd witnessed in Ukraine, Durrani wrote the article you see on your screen. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner, he condescendingly says, "Mr. Jones is a man of a keen mind. It appears he made a 40-mile walk through the villages in Kharkiv, and he found conditions sad." And then in the upper right, you see a famous quote: "To put it brutally, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs." And then he likens what happened in the countryside to a war where you have casualties. And then he says, there is no actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition. You know, a distinction that might be lost on us. And goes on to say, if the harvest this year is okay, the present difficulties will be speedily forgotten. I can talk more about the motivation of the other Moscow-based journalists. There's an autobiography of a man called Eugene Lyons, who at the time didn't talk about the Holodomor, but had a guilty conscience later and said, poor Gareth Jones must have been the most surprised human being alive when the facts he painstakingly garnered from the mouths of we journalists in Moscow were then snowed under by our denials. And we can talk about why they did that later. But it's also important to note that world leaders were motivated to believe or to pretend to believe Durrani. There were economic interests, there was the sale of goods and equipment to the USSR, and there was the fact of Hitler's growing power. And suffice it to say that the United States recognized the Soviet Union in 1933. And I would add that Walter Durrani received a standing ovation at a dinner to mark that occasion. To turn to the photos, we have a photo directory, the work of an amazing librarian, Lana Babi, largely. There are very few photos of the famine. It's important to note that there are photos from an earlier, less deadly famine in the 1920s. Those photos exist because the Soviet Union allowed foreign aid workers in, and those foreign aid workers documented what they saw. There are no such photos from the Holodomor because the authorities never admitted there was a famine, not for 50 years. What we do have is a handful of photos taken surreptitiously by foreigners, and even a rare set by a local photographer. These photos are by Austrian chemist Alexander Wienerberger, who smuggled them out through diplomatic pouch. These two, I would like to point out about these photos that they were taken in the city of Kharkiv or on its outskirts. We have no photos from where the Holodomor would have been worst, the countryside. There were two other foreigners who took photos. James Abbey, he was a celebrity photographer of the day who became a photojournalist. On the left, you see a photo he was arrested for. It was forbidden to take photos of railway scenes. And you can see he captions it that the starving were waiting in vain for trains that might take them somewhere where food would be. Whiting Williams was a labor expert. He had been to the Soviet Union before and was shocked when he returned to Ukraine in 1933. The scene on the left, he says the child had died. On the right are carts that would go around and collect the orphans and abandoned children. Some children were outright orphaned. Others were abandoned parents who hoped that in the cities, perhaps someone with food would take mercy on their children, or that in an orphanage, they might have a better chance of survival. Whiting's returned to the United States expecting to be able to publish an article, but he was surprised that editors who'd published him before told him they didn't want to overdo it with unfavorable articles about the USSR. And he did finally publish in a London-based publication. These photos are fascinating. In 2007, researchers stumbled on this set of photos in the criminal file of a man named Nikolai Bokan. He was a photographer, and the photos were part of the evidence against him of his engagement in anti-Soviet propaganda. Some of the photos document his experience of the Holodomor, including the death of his son Konstantin from starvation. You can see this one, the inscription says, remembering Kostya, Konstantin, who died of starvation. And this is the father standing at the grave, and the inscription says, Konstantin Bokan died June 30th, 1933, in a field from overwork on the collective farm and malnutrition. I should add that the father would die in a labor camp in 1947. I have this slide here to give a sense of the climate of the time, the fascination with the grand Soviet experiment, the workers' paradise. Frederick Griffin was a journalist who gave a presentation to a businessmen's club in Toronto in October of '32. His comments speak to what people, well, I'll turn to that in a second. I don't have this highlighted, I'll just read it. Russia has awakened. The bear that walks like a man has emerged from the lair, no longer a shambling, witless, stupid, leaderless creature to be mocked, but a youthful, magnificent giant who challenges the world, vital, lean, hard, eager, spiritually athletic, throbbing with energy, arrayed with hope. And then he goes on, Russia is incredible. He describes all the things Russia didn't used to have, but what it did have was 100 million peasants who were in the mass primitive, squalid, barbarous, and superstitious. I just contrast that, if you remember Gareth Jones, the humanity of talking to somebody locally, walking along, going to a home, seeing how they lived. Frederick Griffin goes on to, he's excited about the workers' clubs, the parks of culture, the factory kitchens for the central supplying of meals to workers. He does, and the great factories that build automobiles, tractors, agricultural implements. He does concede that the system had its terrorist side. It had its horrors, some of them recent enough, but we'll forget about them as we have forgotten about the French guillotine, and the horrors will be as chaff in the balance. And I think his comments speak to how what people know and don't know can be connected to who we think matters and who we think doesn't matter. Griffith could rave about great factories producing steel and factory kitchens supplying workers with meals, and overlook the death of millions of peasants who he wrote off as squalid, barbarous, primitive, and superstitious. They were merely chaff that would be swept away by history in the creation of a proletarian utopia. Quickly, this slide is a page from the HREC website. I want to just tell you that we have a number of resources. I could discuss it more. I'd be happy to have contact with any of you about our resources. I would just like to conclude by saying, I think I've mentioned now about 5 factors why the Holodomor was known and not known at the same time. There was denial of the famine by the Soviet authorities for more than 50 years. There was the reporting of Walter Duranty and other journalists. World leaders had a willingness to hear what was convenient for economic and political reasons. There was excitement in many circles about the Soviet experiment. There was an attitude about the victims, dismissed as mere peasants. And I'd like to add one other that I come across in my own work, that narratives about Soviet history were established before the Soviet Union collapsed, but it took the collapse of the Soviet Union for the archives to open up. And it was only with the opening of the archives that it was possible to look at the documents and assess motivations and what the Soviet authorities knew and didn't know. And it became possible to say definitively that the Soviet authorities, central authorities, were fully aware of famine conditions when, instead of alleviating the famine, they took measures that actually worsened it and used famine as a political tool. I'll end. I want to show you some quick photos before I leave. I have read many accounts of survivors, and they will describe these teams that would come to their homes with metal rods poking in the walls, poking in the ceilings, the flooring, looking for hidden grain and hidden food. One day I received an email with the following photos attached, and I gasped. There were the metal rods I'd read about so many times. I show this to make the point that research is ongoing, and we still don't know what we'll find in local collections and local archives. Thank you so much for your attention.